Good morning. Thank you very much for attending our workshop today. It's a privilege to be here to talk about orthopedic smart implants. What we're going to do is I'm going to just give a quick introduction to what we're talking about when we say smart implants. And then each of our three speakers is going to talk a little bit about their technology, their products, their company. We're all in the smart implant space, but you'll see that it's very different technology, different directions that each of them are taking things. When we say orthopedic smart implants, this can mean a lot of different things. There are applications in total joints, in spine, and in long bones, in trauma. So let me give a simple example, and when our speakers present, they'll talk a little bit more about some of the more state-of-the-art. But if we take the long bone, the trauma application, can you advance the slide for me? It's not going. So if we look at the fractured bone as shown in the diagram on the right, that's a weight-bearing bone. Initially after the fracture, the patient goes to weight bear on that bone. The bone has effectively a zero stiffness, meaning that it cannot bear any weight. So when the patient steps down on that bone, all of the forces that are transmitted through the bone are actually transmitted through the plate. As that fracture starts to heal and a callus forms and the stiffness of that callus goes up, more and more force can be transmitted through the bone, and subsequently less and less force is transmitted through the plate. And so if I can measure the forces that are being transmitted through the plate, I can actually diagnose the progress of healing, and the plate is a smart implant. Okay, so that's a very simple example. Again, our speakers will talk much more about some more advanced applications. The term smart implants comes from a Belgian trauma surgeon, Frans Bernie. And in this paper, he wrote many papers, but in this one in the year 2000, he talks about the first 30 years of his work in smart implants. And I like this diagram that's shown here because it sort of shows the evolution of the technology from tethered electronics that extended percutaneously all the way to what he envisioned and was not yet reality in 2000 on the far right, which is sensors contained totally within the implant itself. Earliest orthopedic use for smart implants, 1966. You can see the total hip, the femoral component here, with sensors there and a percutaneous lead. The idea was after a few days of data collection, the surgeons would yank on the lead, remove it from the implant, and they would actually have some data. Orthopedic implants are a particularly good target for making them smart, if you will. The large volume, the bulk of the implants makes them very useful for hiding things like electronics. You can see in this application they actually fit 5 circuit boards inside of the femoral component back in the 1970s. In spine, there are also some very early studies that have looked at using smart implants to better understand, in this case, spine biomechanics based on Harrington rods. At this time back in Sweden, scoliosis procedures were a 2-stage procedure. Go in once, do a partial correction, put in Harrington rod. In this case, those were instrumented with sensors. And then 6 weeks or so later, they would go in, take that first one out, do a further correction, and put a second one in. So a good opportunity to temporarily put a smart implant in. Can you advance that? Thank you. Also in trauma, again, you can see here a femoral rod, just one example. This rod is cut in half, strain gauges, which are sensors, placed on the inside of the rod, and then laser welded back together again. And then more of a modern era, this is out of Charité Hospital in Berlin. You can see a total shoulder replacement, same group, same technology, total hip replacement. As you can see, as electronics and materials have gotten more sophisticated, the modifications to the implants have been minimized. And what we see here, this is still in preclinical research. You can see the latest technology adding on to a plate which requires no modification of the plate whatsoever. So the state of the art over these last 50 years as research tools has been what I would say complex electronics, significant modifications to implants. And if we look at all of these studies that have happened in the research world for the last 50 years, we're talking about a total of about 120 patients total in the history of the world that have gotten smart implants. So we've had these research tools. You can see as the technology has evolved over the decades, smart implants have been in research, but only in clinical practice for a very short period of time. Around 2012, major breakthrough with OrthoSensor. This, of course, is a trial that goes in the operating room, not a permanent implant. That gives the surgeon some real-time feedback about what's going on in the OR. And then finally, a little bit over a year ago, our first permanent smart implant to hit the market. So there's a big push, a lot of hype around this now, although these technology and the concept of smart implants has been around for about 50 years. There's a lot of push as the first products are making it to market. And if you look at the last sentence there in the tagline, it'll take time to figure out how we incorporate that data into patient care. So there's a lot of hype around these, and the question is there value from a clinical standpoint, and where is that value? So with that, we have our three panelists. We're each going to talk a little bit more about their technology, about their products, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the value and what some of the challenges are going forward. Thank you. There's a big delay. If you want that.
I don't mean that.
Yep.
All right, so I developed a smart implant technology, and I'm in the process of spinning out a company from my university, and it is based on spinal fusion and trying to monitor the progress of spinal fusion as it heals. So it uses a similar technology to the fracture plate that was discussed earlier, that at first you're going to have really heavy load bearing on the spinal rods, and then over time that load is going to decrease and then plateau at some minimal value, at which point you would know that you have fusion without having reliance upon x-rays, which have many non-positive impacts, including the metal hardwares right in the middle of what you're trying to take an x-ray of, and also bone mineralizes over time. So there's an inherent delay if you're waiting upon an x-ray to tell you when something is fused. So there's many challenges with spinal fusion. First of all, it's a very common procedure. So there are about 1 million fusion surgeries per year in the US, broken down as shown on the slide. And this has shown an increase decade per decade of about 140%. It is the most expensive surgical procedure because of the post-surgical cost. And this is mostly related to the length of time for disability, and that is because of delayed diagnosis of spinal fusion. The current X-ray technology, which I'd like to point out was developed in like 1876 or something like that, it's still essentially the same method, and it takes about 4 months for a fusion to become visible via X-ray. So we really need a faster, more accurate way that's completely independent of X-rays. And so what I've developed is a wireless implant based on strain. So first and foremost, this is a battery-free design, and I'm using wireless power for the device. And the reason that I'm doing that is because spinal implants are not typically removed after the fusion has formed. They remain in the body, and I don't want any harm to come to the patient over time, if 20 years later, if this were to leach out. But also it gives you the ability to monitor changes in the fusion, because we know that if you do a spinal fusion, the end-plate loading changes, etc. And so you could see that if you had a battery-free design. Secondly, I'm using wireless power and data transmission as well. Everything is integrated into a housing that's hermetically sealed, and it's external to the rod itself. So I don't want to change the mechanical integrity of the rod, so it's added to that. And it incorporates an external reader. A concept of that is shown on the right, and that's providing both the power and receiving the implanted data. And then I envision storing this data on the cloud, which would enable digital and remote patient monitoring. You don't need that.
So, good morning, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar faces. I'm Ben Herzog, CEO of Intelligent Implants. I'll start by saying this is an exciting time in orthopedics. I think we are, there are a lot of questions about why hasn't this taken off. We've obviously been talking about smart implants for many decades now, and there's clearly advances in technology that are making this happen. There are advances in the way we think about healthcare and delivery and reimbursement, and all those things I think are starting to converge, and I'm very bullish on this. So we have developed a technology that's kind of a wirelessly enabled active technology that we can embed in orthopedic implants, where we're using electrical signals to accelerate bone growth, control that bone growth, and then measure that bone growth. And so in one sense, what we've done is miniaturize the electrical bone growth stimulator, small enough that we can embed it in the orthopedic implant, and then we deliver those signals locally, so we have a lot of control of exactly where that stimulation is happening. And then we're using that same technology to actually measure the new bone grown, that new bone that's growing in, and all of that's transmitted wirelessly to the cloud, so now we can track all of that. This is a technology that could be applied broadly across orthopedics, almost any implant that you want to accelerate healing and be able to keep track of that healing. But you're going to see a common theme here that we're starting in spine. Our first product's called the SmartFuse Cage. It's an interbody spacer that has our technology embedded in it. So our system actually has three components. There's the implant. Sorry, trying to get this to advance. And one more. There's the implant itself, and like Debbie, we don't want to put a battery in our implant, so we power it wirelessly. So there's an external medical wearable that the patient wears when they're getting therapy or when you need to collect data, and it wirelessly transmits power to the device, gives it instructions, tells it what to stim, how to stim, and then when we collect data from the device, it flows back to the CCAP, and that transmits it to the cloud. And the SmartFuse Cloud is the third component of our system. And this is where the physician can track the progress of a patient, where the patient can interact with our system, we can track compliance, things like that. So from a technology perspective, these are kind of new ideas in orthopedics, not new in the research setting, but new commercially. And it's stuff that's very familiar to, for instance, interventional cardiology. We're hermetically sealing electronics in an implant. Where we have sensors and leads and electrodes. So in our device, we've miniaturized the electronics for the stimulator down to less than 1 cc of volume. We hermetically seal that in a titanium nose of our device, and then our electrodes and our antennas for harvesting energy are all in a peak body of the device. So a lot of new not new manufacturing techniques, but new techniques that are being applied in orthopedics to accommodate the electronics. Part of our special sauce is we're delivering the electrical stimulation across this array of electrodes. So we have electrodes inside the cage window, on the outside of the body, and what that allows us to do is have really precise control. I can activate those electrode points independently, so I can actually steer the electrical stimulation. And so, in a sense, I can get the body to 3D print bone in situ exactly where we want to accelerate healing, to optimize outcomes. And then what we did is we said, well, all right, bone's an electrical insulator, so as that new bone grows in, I wonder if we can see anything interesting in those electrodes. And by taking impedance measurements, we can actually see the new bone growing in. We can detect that. And because we have an array of electrodes, we can spatially resolve where that bone is. And all of this goes up to the cloud. It's all done remotely. And so now we have a system where you can close the loop for the first time. You have a therapeutic to improve outcomes. You have a way of monitoring all of that. You can close the loop and make adjustments, and all that can be done remotely. Just to give you a sense of where we are, preclinical, lots of chronic large animal data. We're raising money to go do our first in-human clinical trial, so we're right at that transition, moving into clinical. Our animal data is done in sheep. We typically do 2 levels, L2, L3, L4, L5, same implant, same procedure, but we just activate the stimulation in one of those levels. And that allows us to isolate the impact of the therapy, and we see 3 times the amount of bone growth, 70% increase in trabecular thickness, and all this happens in about half the time. So a lot more bone, better quality bone, and it happens a lot quicker. and all of that goes to the cloud. And so now for the first time, the clinician or the care team can monitor these patients from home without CTs, without x-rays, know who's tracking towards a fusion, know who's not, have an opportunity to intervene, make corrections to the therapy, maybe turn the therapy on in a patient that you know is not tracking. And to me as an entrepreneur, that's the real excitement, being able to close that loop and improve patient outcomes better than we've ever been able to do just with dumb traditional implants, if you'll allow me that. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Amir Alabi. I'm the CTO of Novosis company. Novosis is the earliest stage startup company. Sorry, guys. We have formed the company about a year ago. And what we are doing is kind of different. We are actually heavily focused on creating intelligent biomaterials that is also integratable to many of the devices that we are currently using. We call the technology Metamaterial, and I will explain for you how we are actually creating these intelligent biomaterials. So first of all, just to give you an idea about the intelligence in biomaterial, because I don't want to use buzzwords. So when we are talking about intelligence in biomaterial, we are talking about materials that can actuate, that can harvest energy, that can communicate, and that can sense. So they should offer a bunch of interesting properties so that we can call them intelligent and biomaterial. So the Metamaterial material technology that we are developing is actually composed of two elements: mechanical metamaterials and nano energy harvesting components. For those who are not familiar with metamaterials or mechanical metamaterials, this is actually an interesting area of research which is growing a lot of attention recently. It's about how we can create artificial structures or artificial material systems that they get their properties from their design, not their material, not their chemical composition. And if I want to put it simply for you, is how can I design an implant, like a titanium implant, which actually gives me any desired mechanical properties or stiffness? Can I design it in a way that it gives me the same density as bone? So the metamaterial concept is interesting because we can rationally design the elements of this structure or this implant to come up with any desired mechanical properties. Now, what we do additionally, we are also introducing this nano energy harvesting technology, which basically results in an implant that is not mechanically tunable. At the same time, it can harvest energy, it can sense out, also it can also generate electricity for electrical stimulation. And there's an example, actually, I put it, you see the video actually, how we can create energy. So the type of nano energy harvesting system that we are using is triboelectric nano generators. I'm sure you have experienced that triboelectrification, but let me explain for you what we mean and how we do it. So triboelectrification is contact electrification. When you rub a balloon to your hair, you have noticed that spark, like it's creating 2,000 volts. It doesn't hurt us because the ampere is so low. So what we have done, we have created the layers of the implants with triboelectric materials. So one design is actually shown on the right side of the screen. You see, so these are multi-layered implants composed of conductive and dielectric materials. So when you apply mechanical excitation, which can be spine loading, which can be heart pulsation, any mechanical loading, they generate electricity under that contact electrification. So you have a signal under loading, and then we show that signal is proportional to the level of load. So when you apply more load to the implant, you will get a larger signal, which is usually 10 times more than piezoelectric power density. And then let me show you the first implant that we actually designed under this concept. So this is again a platform biomaterial technology. So we can design different type of implants. The one that you see here is an inner body fusion cage. And the reason that actually we decided to design an inner body fusion cage is basically I've worked a lot on the spinal fusion for the past 10 years. And fusion cages are perfect because they are in contact with vertebrae, so they are like in direct contact with the load. so they can give you very interesting information about the fusion progress. So the structure that you see there right in the middle of the screen is a multi-layered metamaterial structure, which is tuned to have a stiffness similar to the bone density of a person that actually we got his CT scans, and then we also have information about his bone density. So we 3D printed this structure with multiple layers, and then we tested this and using synthetic models and also using human cadaver models. We showed that we can generate that signal. So what is cool about the signal is that now you have a signal that changes as the FSU stiffness changes. So if bone grows there, you will have less deformation, smaller signal. So when the bone heals, you basically shouldn't be able to see any signal. We have done this with some simulated fusion scenarios where we are putting like different materials into the disc space and then check the signal of the implant. So the implant is sensing, you can actually save the energy for empowering other electronics. But one of the features that I'm personally excited about this implant is that because of the type of contact electrification, it also sends out a signal that we can also receive it with our electrodes. So basically the sensor communicates with you, and the graph that you see on the right side corner down there is actually shows that when we put the implant into SPF, which is stimulated body fluid like blood, I mean, we can really transmit the data and collect it. So the data can be transmitted and collected by a smartphone or any cloud connectable smart device. And what we are doing right now, we are actually exploring other applications for this in different areas. Like we have designed a cardiovascular stent based on this concept. We have designed plastic insert in the TKRs. Actually, we are right now working on that one. And I guess there are a lot of other applications, and there are, of course, a lot of challenges that we are going to talk about that hopefully after this.
All right, very good. So you can see that we have different technologies that are the basis for the smart implants for each of these three different companies, each of the three different products. Debbie's company is primarily working with strain-based products, Ben focusing on impedance, and Amir with the metamaterials. So let me ask you guys, with each of your products or the line that you're working with, what do you see, what's the biggest barrier to entry, the biggest hurdle that you see coming forward to get from, again, we've been largely for decades, which is smart implants as interesting research tools, but yet breaking through that barrier. This is very new. We only have one permanent implant that has broken through that barrier to actually make it to market. So Deb, what do you see as being your biggest barrier to getting this over the hurdle? And that, is it technology based? Is it regulatory? Is it reimbursement? So how far ahead have you thought? Where do you see the big hurdles being?
Well, I think the biggest hurdle is actually the industry itself. It's a conservative group, and we have to go through regulatory approval, and the FDA is by nature a very conservative organization. And when we're doing something in the implant space, we're implanting something that's going to be in the body for decades, and it can't be repaired, it can't be inspected, it cannot be easily replaced. So if we want to introduce smart electronics, we really have to think about the integrity of the implant, and that we're not altering that in some way that's going to make it not last or introduce new failure modes that we haven't had before. And I think all of the technological hurdles, manufacturing hurdles, electronics and stuff can be solved with time, but the regulatory ones are harder, and as part of that, we want to get the industry to accept this technology, and that's not going to happen unless the manufacturing industry sees the value, that this is something that they could get extra reimbursement for, that surgeons are clamoring for, that's going to help differentiate them from their competitors. So that has to be part of it as well.
Ben, what are your thoughts on that? Biggest barrier to entry?
Yeah, look, I think I don't worry so much about the technology. What I worry about is, can we demonstrate the value proposition? You know, we have to be able to demonstrate that we can do something with the data, and that thing is improving patient outcomes. Yeah, for me, that as an entrepreneur, that's my focus. How are we going to improve patient outcomes with this? Data for data's sake doesn't make any sense. You know, we talk about it. Every panel I've been on in the last 2 years is all about data and what we're going to do with this data. So our challenge is make sure we're generating data that's actionable, that's going to improve patient outcomes, and then once you've done that, we can figure out the rest. But I agree that as this evolves and becomes more mainstream and we try to launch these things, you start to run into other issues, which is how we get paid in medicine, you know, what we're getting paid for. A lot of the innovation that's happened in orthopedics, we sell widgets, we make money selling widgets, but a lot of the innovation has shifted away from the implants to navigation and things like that, which are enabling technologies, but at the end of the day, they're really just to sell more widgets, right? So what I'd like to see is the productization of these innovations that we're doing. Once the product is the innovation, then you're really getting to a point, I think, where you hit mainstream with these things. So.
And I think the clinical value, we'll come back to that in a second, because I think that is huge for moving this whole field, you know, forward. But Amir, what do you see, especially the metamaterials? It's sort of a newer, if you will, technology, especially in the orthopedic space. What do you see as being some of the biggest barriers for moving that technology and products based on that forward towards commercialization?
Absolutely. So first of all, I agree with my colleagues and friends that industry needs to support innovation a lot more. Like we hear a lot of stories from like everyone that this is so interesting, this is a unique technology, but at the end of the day, we need support from the industry to push this forward. But on the technology side, I would say like 3D printing is now becoming a norm in designing implants. But what is actually I am personally concerned is about multi-material printing, because specifically the things that I've been working so far, they really require multi-material printing. And I'm still surprised at why there's no such a huge push for multi-material printing, because basically we can create many of these implants with advanced functionalities by developing a more functional 3D printing system. And that's one of the technical challenges that I have so far specifically in the area of metamaterial implants. But again, I guess the technology is there. We can come up with solutions for sure, but we need more support, of course.
Yeah, and of course, we're all, at least by background, engineers, so it's easy for us to say the technology will get there. We sort of are very biased with that perspective.
You can solve it.
Right, and there are other challenges as well. I want to come back. Ben, you started talking about demonstrating the clinical value, and I think it's more coincidence than anything else that all three of you are in the spine space. Yeah. There's been a lot of effort. Of course, the biggest markets in orthopedics are in total joints. We have the first permanent smart implant, which is a total joint, which is a knee. I know that a surgeon locally where I am is using that. I've asked him about what he does with the data, and in his practice, he's quite frank, and he said, I'm using that more for advertising and promotion to grow my practice than I am focusing on the data. You talk about actually adding value and actionable. What do you think spine is unique for that? What do you sort of see as being the direction where smart implants can really contribute?
Yeah, I feel like there were a lot of questions embedded in there. Right. So on the spine piece, so our company, when I got involved, has actually had some inertia towards spine. One of our founding surgeon was a spine surgeon. They got started there. But when I got involved, I took a step back and looked across orthopedics broadly, and getting back to how are we going to improve patient outcomes? Where can I move the needle? Like, where's the highest value deployment of a technology like this? And I think there are quite a few indications, trauma and major joints, things like that. But I kept coming back to spine. You know, when you really look at spinal fusion success, you know, the best numbers I see in real clinical data, you see 30% failure rates. You know, and we see it over and over again. And I think that data set is highly biased towards healthy patients. Yes. Surgeons I know don't want to do high-risk patients. They just won't do them. So if you start to think about all the patients out there that could need spine fusion that aren't getting it now, there's a big clinical unmet need. So that focused me. From a technology perspective, it's one of the most challenging. You have the least real estate to work with. You're deeper in the body. You know, you're near major blood vessels. You're near the spinal cord. But what it did for us is it we're actually doing TLIF first, so the smallest lumbar implant, but it's forced us to get the technology way down the road. We had to miniaturize it enough to fully embed it in a TLIF. And if I can put it in a TLIF, I can put it in almost anything else. And so that's forced us on a technology to think about manufacturing, supply chain, all of those things into there. But there are indications for this across orthopedics. Not every patient needs a smart implant, but almost every use of orthopedic implants, you can tease out, clinical scenarios where these things could really change what we do with patients and problematic patients.
Yeah, and Debbie, you started off by saying, that the biggest barrier to pushing this forward is to demonstrating that value.
Right.
So for your product, the direction that you guys are going, where do you see the big clinical value being there?
So I chose spine for the same kind of reasons, where there was the biggest opportunity there. And if you're going to demonstrate a new technology and show its value, you want to go with something that has, a large market. And with, 1 million of these spinal fusion procedures, you have an opportunity to capture some small percentage of that to bring in this new technology. But I really see what I'm developing as more of a platform technology, that I'm trying to solve the technical challenges. How can you keep something hermetically sealed for 20 plus years with wireless power and communication? That's no small feat. And once you use a titanium canister that's welded, yes, you can get hermetic sealing, no problem. But you can't get wireless power in that scenario. And so looking at alternative materials and going down the route that Amir is going, with different ways of getting power and communication with your device, is what I'm hoping to work on, so that whatever your application is, you have a platform that could encapsulate that and use it in the body.
Very good. So I'm going to continue to ask questions here. Let me ask one more question, and if anybody in the audience has a question, we have a microphone, I think, that we can circulate around. So be thinking about your questions, and I'll reach out or come back in 1 second. So generally, Amir, why don't you start with this one? So, adding smart technology to I think for those of us who've designed implants, to call them dumb is insulting, but we know what you mean by that.
Sorry.
Yeah. So let's say a non-smart implant, right? So adding that technology, even adding the external components, readers, whatever it might be that comes with that, maybe adding extra steps in the operating room, that all comes with a cost. Right, and we heard this morning in the keynote address about adding value, looking at the ratio of cost to quality, really adding value. Can you comment about, for the metamaterials and the direction that you're going in particular, do you feel like there is an avenue there to actually add value to the system? I don't know what the materials are, the cost that you're using, whether that is going to add a lot of expense, no expense, whatever. Just talk a little bit about what you see the value proposition being here.
So let me first start with this. One of the interesting things actually that my friends also discuss is about technologies that can be integrated into the existing systems. So it's not something new. So we are integrating everything into the existing system, which means that already cost is considered in this design. So you're just adding another element and you try to integrate this. But like whenever I'm talking with surgeons and other people in the area, we are always like the cost is or the value proposition is always a concern. But like the things that we are working, the materials that we are working, they're all biocompatible materials like titanium, PLA, TPU, the materials that are out there and 3D printable. So cost is really justified for that. Like the implants are not going to cost you. I would say cost might not really be an issue, okay? Because again, we are using the same materials that we are using. The challenge, I would say, for most of the surgeons that I'm talking is the same question that we are receiving, that how can I interpret the data? Like we are talking about how we are collecting the data, we are taking it out, but honestly, it needs processing. It needs a sort of like at least some interpretation for surgeons, because a surgeon is not going to go and develop a machine learning model or AI model to interpret that. So I would say creating this integrated system which gives simple answer to the surgeon question, that's a challenge. So basically we are not only supposed to design a device, This is an entire system, but the output, that simple out and understandable output for surgeon, that's the key. That's the system, I would say, that adds a little bit more complication.
So sort of a green light or red light. Ben, we were talking about that last night.
Yes,
your patient is going down path A or your patient is going down path
exactly,
B.
yes.
Ben, what about you? Your thoughts on adding value and how to do that with smart implants relative to potentially the increase in cost?
Yeah, so like this morning we talked about, quality of life year over cost is kind of the way we measure value in this. But the reality is, if you take a step back, and that's my focus, improving patient outcomes, but there are other ways to create value in the healthcare system. So I'll give you an example with remote monitoring, things like that. So give you a concrete example. You go to a busy surgeon's office when he's in clinic, and you look at all the people sitting in the waiting room, 50 seats. How many of those are new patients and how many of those are follow-up visits? A surgeon wants to do surgery, a surgeon gets paid to do surgery, but they're spending all their clinic time mostly with follow-up patients. Well, if with smart implants we could move that to remote sensing and do that at home, we can probably eliminate a lot of those patients having to come in and see the surgeon. That's better for the patient, it's lower cost. Now all of a sudden that surgeon, instead of having 3 clinic days and 2 surgery days, if we could just flip that to 3 surgery days and 2 clinic days, that's huge value creation for the surgeon's practice. It's huge value creation for the hospital. So I think we have to look holistically at value creation within the healthcare system, but we have to focus on value creation. I mean, you can't just have data for data's sake. So it all has to come back, whether you're improving patient outcomes or you're creating value otherwise in the healthcare system. You have to have a very strong value proposition, or nobody's going to ever adopt any of this stuff.
I'll come back to you in a second. So do we have any questions from the audience? I could go on for days here. Anybody have a question, comment to make? We have one way up in the front.
Thank you. When it comes to data ownership and creating value, what do you think is the best path? Is it letting the clinicians and the patients own the data? Is it keeping it internal so you can use it for proprietary R&D, or is it making it open source so as many people as possible have access to it?
And I actually think one of a question related to that too. I gave a talk with the FDA, and they're asking questions about HIPAA and where's the data and safety and security of the data. So what do you guys think? What do you think as far as where the data should, what should the data look like? Where should it reside? Who owns the data? Is that essentially what you're asking?
Yeah, and I actually see the data as being a new product in and of itself. Like, we don't know right now what makes some people fuse really fast and others not. We don't know what demographic changes between patients or health indications change their outcomes. So that data becomes super valuable in and of itself. And I know that I would want that database to be available so that we could all benefit from it and we could all use it as a metric to gauge our new technology against. But I don't know in this environment, especially with HIPAA and other privacy things, are we going to be able to anonymize that data in a way that it could be used for research? I know that some of these DNA testing companies like 23andMe are releasing the anonymized data to researchers to be able to study rare diseases and things. So maybe we can develop that. And I know that as an orthopedic company, you'd want to keep it proprietary because it has a lot of value to have that data and to be able to use it for improving your own outcomes and thus your own profitability. But my hope would be that it would be open.
I've got a strong view on this. The patients own the data. So I don't know if I'm right, but that's my strong view, that the patients have to own the data. Now, for us to extract value out of that data like we're talking about, to kind of realize the vision of all this, we have to have access to data. Industry has to have access to the data. The researchers have to have access to data. The clinician has to have access to data. So this is one of these growing pains, that's healthcare's facing overall. How do we navigate that? How we do it in a way so we can actually extract value from that data? But I feel very strongly at the end of the day, patient owns their own data.
Interesting.
I absolutely agree with Ben about that. I think patient owns the data, but if we really can make them anonymous, I mean, it can help a lot to make more progress, make the clinical outcomes even better.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I guess patient owns the data. But we can really benefit from having even the data for improving the outcomes for sure.
And I think an important adjunct to that, and Amir, you started talking about this earlier, excuse me, is, what does that data look like, right?
Yeah.
To the clinician, they're not going to want to see graphs, presumably. They're not going to want to see, thousands of data points or anything like that. It has to be maybe red or green,
Yes.
and it's a matter of working with the clinicians to understand what's meaningful to them and how everything becomes distilled down to something, Ben, in your words, that's actionable with respect to the progression of care.
That's a big challenge for us as an industry, is how do we package it up and make it fit within the physician's workflow? I mean, no surgeon I've ever talked to is going to want to get on a dashboard and check their patients. Unless they get paid for that, and that's again the growing pain. Maybe we have to rethink reimbursement and how we get paid and how value is created and how it gets reimbursed appropriately. But in today's world, no surgeon's going to do that. So we as an industry have to figure out, okay, what does that mean? How do we package it up? How do we put it? And is it, red light? But if we can do that, and we can say, of your 300 patients who would have come into clinic this month for follow-up, if we can identify using the data and AI and whatever tools we have at our disposal, the 2 patients who really need your attention, and we can call those out and say, hey, Dr. Amir, those are the 2, get them in here, have a look, do something about it. There's huge value in that. And we can do that with these technologies we're talking about.
All right, as we're wrapping up the session here, I'll ask each of you guys, we'll just go down the road and maybe answer one more question. So let's say you have a magic wand and a dump truck full of money. What do you think it would take to prove to the orthopedic community, to the clinicians in particular, that the smart implants, maybe your own product, but smart implants in general, actually have value, right? I mean, this is, I think, the crux of what we're talking about here is where is the value? Can we demonstrate that? How do we show this action? So what would it take to demonstrate that? So again, you've got the magic wand, you've got all the money in the world. What do you want to do? How do you want to show that? Debbie?
I think we need proof. I mean, it's great. It sounds great on paper. It works great in theory. Maybe it works great in benchtop testing. But we have to have proof that it works to make a difference in the clinical outcome. And the only way to do that is to do more clinical trials. And so we have to push it through the animal studies to make sure it's safe and effective, and then get it into human clinical trials where we can start reporting on its effectiveness and that it's making a difference. And what that metric is depends on what type of smart implant you're trying to develop. Are you trying to reduce time and therefore cost that way? Are you trying to improve the rate of fusion and therefore have more successful outcomes? Or are you trying to revolutionize how we're doing a particular implant? So depending on the metric, that's where you would want to focus. But I think the overall goal is that we need to provide that proof before the orthopedic industry is going to want to adopt it.
Ben, thoughts?
Clinical trials. That's what I do with the money. Clinical trial. What does it cost to do a PMA clinical trial? And I think, again, it's the challenge of this industry. I'm a newcomer. I spent the last decade in interventional cardiology, where you have a lot of class 3 clinical trials, PMA trials. And here, so much of our industry is 510K that we don't have that kind of data in this industry. And with economic pressures and reimbursement pressures and all that, at the end of the day, it's going to take good clinical data. So I think if we go into it acknowledging that, and us as entrepreneurs are kind of gearing up, raising money to go do those clinical studies, at the end of the day, I think that wins.
Amir, anything to add to that?
I mean, like money is the key, of course. We are an early stage startup, so we need a lot of money.
He said you have a truck full of money, I think is what he said.
A truck, I will use it for animal testing, human clinical testing. But I'm also considering another thing, which is creating that culture of using smart implants, specifically for surgeons. Like, I would just spend a lot of time, putting workshops and educating, talking with them, make it easier. Specifically, No offense to older surgeons, but I'm working with both of them. Like the youngers are so passionate about the technology. The older surgeons, I mean, they are in comfort, zone. It's really tough to get them out of that. But we need some sort of cultural also movement or educational. I don't know how to put it. Also, I will allocate a part of that for promoting that part.
Yeah, and this morning during the keynote, there was a part of the discussion was about objective data versus subjective data. And of course, when we're talking about collecting quantitative information, that becomes very objective. Most clinicians today rely on, as was part of the discussion this morning, those subjective data, the shades of gray on an x-ray or how the patient tells you that you're feeling. And so it will presumably end up with a shift in the mindset for the clinicians to adopt this. And I think the value has to be demonstrated unequivocally and show the value here. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for attending our session. The panelists will be sticking around if you have more questions for them. And with that, let's thank our panelists for being with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.